So, ladies and gentlemen, welcome again. Welcome especially to those who just joined us, and there will still be people who will continue dropping into this session tonight about NATO and the report of the Reflection Group. My name is Christian Mölling. I'm the Research Director of the German Council on Foreign Relations. I have the pleasure to moderate this round, which is about, as I said, about the report of the Reflection Group on NATO 2030. NATO 2030, that is kind of the reference point on the time horizon for something, or for the challenge that the Secretary General of NATO, Jens Stoltenberg, said there are three things that basically have to be met. One is NATO has to remain militarily strong. It has to have its function as a political consulting body, and it has to basically be more active on the global scale. So these three things are the challenges, or to square the cycle if you want to, possibly also. But what does it mean in concrete terms for NATO? How could this be implemented with view of 2030? That has been the challenge to the Reflection Group that was headed by Thomas de Maizière and by Wess, so a German and a US, at a time when possibly the relationship between the two countries were not the best ones, and we all hope this is going better. Nonetheless, the report has been, obviously, if you take the quantities, rather fruitful. 180 or more recommendations came out of it, and so think tankers are wondering what they can contribute over the next 2 years to this debate. As we can't contribute anything, we have invited Thomas de Maizière and Wess to this round and let us hear about their ideas of what should be done. So I will give the two chairs of the Reflection Group first the panel, the floor. And afterwards, I would ask Siemtje Möller and Heiner Braus to respond to that. Siemtje Möller is the spokeswoman of the Social Democratic Party in the Defense Committee. First woman ever in this position for the Social Democratic Party. So very much welcome, Siemtje Möller. And Heiner Braus, who is, I always have problems in doing it this right. He has been the Assistant Secretary, I can only say in German, the Beigeordneter Generalsekretär for NATO defense planning and defense policy, but he will correct me on that if I have been wrong, definitely. Heiner Braus commenting this from, I don't know how many decades he has been in the service of NATO, but I always, if I listen to him, it's a pleasure, because I always get a nuance of what is happening in this machinery. So this is the setup. After that, you will have the opportunity to raise questions, comments, and I'll try to put this to our panelists. Last remark, Siemtje Möller will have to leave us a little bit earlier. So all the questions that you have for the bright future of the Social Democrats in defense, put them up early on. And therefore, if there are, one thing I should mention with regard to housekeeping rules, you can post, of course, questions in the chat. You can also try and raise your hands. As we are expecting more than 100 participants here, please don't mind if I basically have to do a selection. I will basically put questions in the second round. Once we come to question and answers, I will put questions together to our panelists so that they have an opportunity to answer as many as possible. But having said that, I would like to hand over to Thomas de Maizière and explain to us what are the most important points from possibly a German point of view that have come out of the report and that should inform the future of NATO and the member states and the allies that now are reading your report, I hope, carefully. Thomas de Maizière, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. I'm very glad that we have this very familiar forum. I see a lot of colleagues and friends from me, former colleagues and experts. Thank you very much for your interest. Well, I'm not going to present a German perspective, at least not during my presentation, perhaps later on during the discussion, because Wess and me, we were together with the other members of the group, independent experts, and we wouldn't have been able to present a consensus paper if we had insist on our national perspectives. And the secret of this group was that all the 10 members of the group represented the variety of the mentalities and options and discussions within NATO, and all of them were able to make compromises. So this is a practical outcome and not a think tank outcome. Probably Wess will explain that better than me later on. This was our goal. We've had from members from Turkey to Denmark, from Poland to France, America and Germany. I'll come to that in a second. So this is, I think, well done by Jens Stoltenberg to put this group together, 5 women and 5 men. We delivered our report the 1st of December to the foreign ministers, and now it's up to Jens Stoltenberg to take them, to think about them and present them as his recommendations to the heads of states. There will be a summit, as I heard, probably in June, perhaps together with a summit with the European Union. And I'm very glad to hear that, because this was one of the recommendations from us, that we need to restart for these NATO-EU relations and cooperation and a summit, or it's difficult to have a summit because of Turkey-Cyprus reasons, you know that, that at least a meeting on the highest possible level is a good opportunity to do so. And it was one of our recommendations. Interesting enough, the American-US elections did not play a role in our discussion for 2 reasons. Number one, it was the approach and the mentality and the loyalty of Wess, because he is a Republican, but he organized everything bipartisan in America. Would be a good symbol or a good role model for those discussions in Europe and Germany. And he had close contacts to the Biden camp, so it's for the new government, I think, a valid report as well. And and between the 2 of us, neglecting the official relations very closely and very quickly, it raised a close friendship. Astonishing enough, we never met. Not only Wess and me, the whole group didn't meet. We've had more than 100 video conferences. We had a lot of experts. So it's really a miracle that this outcome has been possible. So, what is our report about? You mentioned the goals. Of course, we highlighted the problems as well, and what NATO needs in the discussions and among themselves is relevance, trust, and efficiency. NATO is not lacking analysis. It's lacking a political will to act together and to have cohesion, to be the #1 forum for security issues. And we put the finger in this wound and said, if NATO has a chance to be relevant again, then it is absolutely necessary to change rituals, discussions, formats, and all these kinds of political meetings, discussions in the future. Our analysis is short. We are proud that we didn't present a think tank paper. We are always joking, think tank papers are excellent in analysis, then global and short in recommendations. We did the opposite. A short analysis, hopefully a good one, but then a long way to go with recommendations. Important ones, not so important ones, relevant ones, tiny little ones, and useful ones as we think. You mentioned nearly 140 recommendations. This was criticized, too many. In a way, it's true, but we tried to organize it that we have main findings. We have recommendations to all sections. I will not go into details. For example, we very much were concentrated on the organization itself as well. Lessons learned exercises about new types of communications, perhaps to build a NATO university or a similar institution, to have fellowships among NATO countries, to invest in startups and all these kind of stuff. I will not go into details, but it's worth to read. These are small recommendations, but very useful ones. So I think it's important to read it. By the way, you can read it on the NATO page, and there will be a German translation within the next days, and then this will be published on the page of the Foreign Office. So just to concentrate now, to focus on the main points. Our starting point, the starting point for the whole discussion should be a new strategic concept for NATO, an updated strategic concept, to put it correct, because we want to keep the 3 core tasks. The starting point for this updated strategic concept should be the next summit. This updated strategic concept should be discussed not so long, a year or a bit more, should not be an excuse for not changing anything. And it should be used as a new chance for the transatlantic dialogue and for a new type and character of political discussions within NATO. So we recommend there as well to have a pledge for a code of conduct for different type of the political discussions. I will come to that when I finish my opening remarks. And then the main recommendations are perhaps the following 7. Number 1, on Russia. In the actual strategic concept, NATO, from 2010, Russia was described as strategic partner. It was before Kremlin, before Ukraine, before Navalny, before all the other issues. So we underlined that business as usual should not be the answer, but we should try to find a way for a constructive dialogue with Russia from a position of strength. Dual track, like the Hamel report recommended it, deterrence and dialogue. It should be the Russian side to refuse it, not our side. Perhaps new ideas on arms control. Perhaps we come to that in the discussion later. But to have a clear and crystal clear position towards the Russian posture, and at the same time find new ways for a constructive dialogue. Not really new. On China, this is new. The rise of China after the strategic concept 2010 is obvious. We recommend that China should not be in the same position as Russia. It could be, or in some ways, it is a military threat, but not in the same dimension like Russia. But it's a systemic rival. There is a geopolitical competition. There's a lot of influence into Europe, into Africa, and there are new types of security issues: infrastructure, trade, supply chain, dependencies. And our recommendation is that NATO needs a strategy on China, probably a special body where NATO discusses all relevant aspects of Chinese politics related to security. And then I will come to that in a second, to to develop a strategic partnership with like-minded countries in the region, Australia, South Korea, Japan, and perhaps Singapore and New Zealand. I think this is an important issue, not to change the transatlantic alliance into an Atlantic-Pacific alliance. So very cautious on Article 5 guarantees for Taiwan or others. This should not be the answer, but to be very clear, analytical, and to have a common analysis and a common approach about vulnerabilities, security vulnerabilities because of the rise of China. Third main recommendation is about new technologies. Our mandate was a political one, so we didn't discuss the role of new technologies for new weapons or so, but the political role of these technologies is very, very important. Cyber, space, artificial intelligence, all this kind of stuff. And this has a political and security political dimension as well. We recommend a summit specially on these issues. I think it has to be on the table of the heads of states, not deep in the technical and political committees. It will change the political scenery all over the world, will create new dependencies and options. This has to be taken into account very clearly. Then fourth, I mentioned it, we want to change the demand-driven into an interest-driven strategy for partners. We have, because of the interest of time, I shorten here, I think it's clear what I mean. Then NATO-EU cooperation. I think, and our recommendation was, and this is not a German perspective now, but a perspective from our reflection group. We think that there is a huge lag between rhetoric and actions. The wording about this cooperation is huge. The actions is poor. If you have 74 projects with priority, then you don't have priorities at all. There are below the highest level, not really serious day-to-day institutional friendly cooperative talks. It's just not the case. What we need really is a restart of this deconfliction mechanism, liaison staffs, a day-to-day work together, common analysis on international affairs and all these kinds of stuff. So there is a necessity for truth in these relations to reduce the wording and increase the doing. And the last and very important point is about, I mentioned it, the internal dimension. Cohesion is important. Consensus is important. But what is not important is that NATO avoids to discuss difficult issues because it could increase tensions. And this is the case in the present. So NATO is not anymore the #1 forum for security issues. It's not the case on China. It's not the case on internal problems. It's very ritualized, the discussions. There you have only formal meetings, more or less. You don't have informal meetings. You don't have meetings with the policy directors, national security advisors, mixed meetings. You should invite internal ministers when you talk about cyber, development ministers when you talk about Africa, technology ministers when you talk about new technologies. It must be really a forum for discussion. NATO should not be afraid that you don't have results in a minute. And I think this is very much important. We recommend to stick closely to the principle of consensus, but we have to avoid this number of blockages. One recommendation is to raise the possibility for blockages on the ministerial level, not deep in the committees, that we perhaps find a way, like we call it in the European Union, verstärkte Zusammenarbeit, so a possibility under a NATO chapeau to allow, in a way, some NATO countries to do more if all agree, but not all of them then have to participate, and to have quicker decisions in crisis management. So to totally change the political culture of debate is crucial for the outcome of these discussions and to get into a new era, NATO 2030. Over, and now with your permission, I would like to hand over to Wess.
Yes, please do so. Wess, would you like to come in?
Yes, thank you, Christian, for the opportunity to join this call, and thanks to DGAP, which is an institution that I know and have a lot of respect for, and it's good to see a lot of friends on the line.
We have to say that Wess has warned us on problems
alongside Speaker Mueller. But let me reciprocate more. It's a really honor to Thomas, and I want to say, past few weeks in Washington, that Thomas, I think he's a great asset to Germany. He's a great Atlantic.
So, Wess, it seems that you again have some problems with the connection. We see whether we can get you back. Otherwise, I would say, if he doesn't come back, and you can give me a heads up, we would just continue with Siemtje Möller and give her already the floor if she is okay with that. I'm just taking this a little bit longer so you can prepare your first words and responding to what has been a comprehensive short introduction by Thomas de Maizière into what they have generated in a non-think tank effort. I've noticed that. Nonetheless, we all have to read it. It may even be brilliant in the recommendations. Now, see, Wess is coming back. We give him another try. He's sitting in Arlington, where obviously the Chinese and Russian intelligence is very busy in trying to tapping the lines. Wess, can you come in again, or is we try to get you back into this? It doesn't look that well.
Sometimes it's good to switch off the camera, and then it works better.
He's trying that already. But maybe in the interest of time, maybe we switch over to Siemtje Möller and then give Wess, once he's back, really back, we give him the opportunity to take the floor. Siemtje Möller, would you like to come in?
Sure, I will do my very best, and would like first to say a fresh hello from the North Coast, or as we say, Moin, here in my region where I come from. I had to smile a little bit when Thomas de Maizière said to not avoid critical discussions. I feel it very close to my heart, to my social democratic heart, that we discuss always controversial, but in the end, it's for the sake of all of us. Well, I had made up my mind or some thoughts on one point that I would like to underline, because I think it will play a role on the political or in the political sphere in the next months, and it is the question of the NATO-Europe alliance, or which role has Europe to play, and especially Germany. Historically, or seen in a historical way, NATO went through some evolutions. It came from in rivalry or as a bloc against Warsaw Pact, then we had the focus on anti-terror. Now we don't really know where to go, or at least we are in the situation or in the position to refocus and restabilize NATO and to find a way and to find the position where we want to sit ourselves. The last years have been tough. I mean, all of us, we were hoping that it would not fall all to pieces. We had Trump in the first, at least couple of months, he was very strong in opposition to NATO. There were some very puzzling words of him. Then we had the mentioning of Macron, but at the same time, when Macron said NATO was brain dead, it was sort of a catalytic converter, because now we are in the process to redefine what is the role of NATO, and this is just the beginning of the process. At least is what it is to my understanding. Also, the prepositions that the group around Thomas de Maizière put on the ground. Then we have, of course, the conflict of Turkey and Greece. It is disturbing inside the NATO, but it's also disturbing inside of Europe, because it changes something. And of course, we have the not really a battle, but at least we had some miscommunication or some misunderstanding between Poland and Germany. So we have some debates, discussions, and also critical discussions on the ground within two of the alliances. So within Europe, but also within NATO. So I think it's just a very good moment to have this process to restabilize NATO and to strengthen at the same time Europe's role. Why? Because I think it's often it is put in opposition to one of each other, but it's not, to my understanding, because both, so the US but also Europe, are two elementary components of NATO. So we have to think which role Europe wants to play and which role we can play. We have up to now always it put into concurrence, but I don't think it has to stand there, because in the end we can both, I think Europe and NATO can have an advantage of a stronger Europe, not in concurrence, but as a complement or complementary to NATO. I think we have to talk about, of course, the question of burden sharing. All of you know better, maybe even than me, that we have a lively debate in Germany how high the burden, the part or part of the burden has to be, and which role we want to play in NATO. But we have to develop a more cohesive or congruent position of Europe, because we have, as I said before, we have, of course, the conflicts within the European, or internal conflicts within the European Union, always in an alliance, or maybe in an alignment to our security policy and to the collective foreign policy. I think one thing that I really like about it is that we have a discourse started on the strategic expansion to Asia, but Thomas de Maizière knows that we have also a critical discussion on the ground in the political sphere, because maybe it's an overspread or an overexpansion. We don't know really how to handle if we, for example, we have a mission ongoing, or maybe also only some training there, what is then with Article 5? And I think we have to reflect on it very critical. And for sure, there are some different views within the different NATO members, and also within the different European Union members. And also the question, what will do the heads of state, and also Jens Stoltenberg with all the prepositions on the ground. Of course, there's prepositions and still no debate or no decision made. However, I think it's a very good point to start. And I don't want to reflect longer. If Wess Mitchell is there, then he could try again. If not, then I would hand over to Heinrich Braus, who is a very good, who knows very much about NATO. I don't know where the moderator is. Maybe this is now also my role.
I'm here. No problems.
Okay.
I'm there. I also found Wess again. Wess, if you want to give it another try, let's do it. We're eager to hear how things are looking from the US perspective or from your perspective.
Sure, I'm happy to do so, Christian, and thanks again. Sorry for the technical trouble, and it was really great to hear Speaker Muller's thoughts just now. Let me just jump right into it and say what I would build on with regards to Thomas's comments and try not to duplicate, maybe just a few observations about the approach that we took and the main message of the report, and a few of the recommendations that I think are particularly important, and maybe that can dovetail with some of what both Speaker Muller and Thomas have said. But first of all, I think just understand the approach that our group was given a very specific task or mandate by Stoltenberg, and we took that task seriously. And it was to give recommendations for strengthening the political dimension of NATO out to 2030. And that is to say, our job was not merely to provide a set of recommendations that would be an extension by other means of the day-to-day debates in the North Atlantic Council. Of course, we were aware of those debates. We were aware of a lot of what was in the newspaper headlines at the time, but we really took seriously the job of looking out to 2030, trying to picture what the world would look like, and then reasoning backwards to a set of recommendations that would not only be creative, but just as importantly, those recommendations needed to be politically and practically plausible, which is to say, and this was a very important filtering mechanism for our recommendations, we didn't want to put anything in the report that would not have a solid prospect of gaining acceptance by all 30 allies. And I always stress that when we talk to audiences who have read the report for the first time. There's a lot of great ideas that we heard for strengthening NATO, but when you bring them down to the practical political dimension, many of them simply would not survive close scrutiny in the NAC. So that's an important thing to keep in mind that I'm sure we will come back to in the Q&A. But again, our starting point was look at the world of 2030. We heard from a lot of experts. What are the likely dynamics? And the biggest of those dynamics, or the biggest trend that we heard repeatedly, is the return of strategic competition between large powers, systemic rivalry as it's talked about in Europe. And I think in particular, from NATO's perspective, the persistence of Russia as an aggressive actor, but also now the rise of China, which is far and away the most significant geopolitical trend of our time. So the report says, in essence, NATO will perforce increasingly find itself in an environment that is characterized by the purposeful and well-resourced moves of both of these large actors, both of which, by the way, are led by authoritarian regimes. There will be other threats and challenges. So terrorism certainly hasn't gone away, pandemics, climate change, etc. But the report is cognizant that not all of these are equal. And then this part is also important, that not all of those threats or risks necessarily need to be a priority for NATO specifically. So we tried to keep in mind what NATO was built to do. And so we tried to look at the world as such, and then sort of provide a set of recommendations that would gear NATO's appreciation of the tools that it will need to kind of a frank recognition of the likely characteristics of that new environment. That's a very different environment than the immediate post-Cold War world, where the West really did not face a pure competitor. And of course, it's very different from the post-9/11 era, when the leitmotif for NATO was out-of-area operations against mainly non-state actors. So the strategic environment that the report imagines or posits is one in which the West will face large states with serious resources that challenge the security of its members. So then, building on that premise, the report outlines a set of recommendations, but not only that, it tries to set priorities among those recommendations. It doesn't just say do everything at once. It tries to provide a clear hierarchy of what's most important. Thomas mentioned the urgent importance of updating the strategic concept. I can't emphasize that enough. The current strategic concept is 10 years old. It's being very quickly overtaken by events. This is a document that was constructed prior to Russia's invasion of Ukraine. It's a document that does not mention China. And if you can imagine the analogous situation you would find yourself in as a private company, if you tried to operate with a strategic plan that was 10 years old and didn't take account of the changes in the international landscape, technology, et cetera, this clearly needs to be updated. As Thomas also mentioned, and I think this is one of the main recommendations of the report, is that China has to figure predominantly more and more in NATO's calculations about the security of its members. There is an idea, a recommendation in the report, for example, to create a consultative body modeled on the Cold War era COCOM structure, but something that would bring together the NAC and maybe even the European Council to aerate positions or discuss China, even when NATO is not necessarily instrumentalized or the tool of choice on every part of the China challenge. I will say on the China discussion, contrary to a lot of what is in the newspapers about a difference of views between the United States and Europe on China, I can't speak for Thomas, but I certainly did not pick up on that dynamic in the group. I think we reached consensus actually fairly early on about both the characterization of the China challenge, the fact that it's a trade partner, but also a security challenge inside the Euro-Atlantic area now. So it's not only an economy, it's not only an economic actor or an Asia-specific actor, but is operating in ways now inside the Euro-Atlantic area that are deleterious to the security of NATO members. Emerging technology, I would highlight that basket of recommendations in the report. I think second only to maybe the general strategy point and the China point. It's near the top of the most salient findings of the report. We talk about a NATO in the report that is at risk of falling behind in the ability to win on the battlefield or even secure the data and privacy and liberties of its publics if it doesn't see the competition for dominance in emerging technologies as a core competence. So we recommend, for example, more of a coordinating function, greater interactions with the EU to deconflict on areas of general data privacy, for example. We recommended the creation of a North Atlantic DARPA, or something that's analogous to the US Office for essentially encouraging innovation and research and development coordination among allies. Thomas mentioned the European Union. I won't elaborate on that in great detail, except to say it was very clear to our group there is a practical need on a day-to-day basis for a deconfliction mechanism to avoid paralysis in certain areas. This is not a criticism, but it is a reflection, I think, of a growing tendency of some members of NATO to withhold support for NATO activities that could in some way undermine the European Union's future ability to act in those areas. Thomas also mentioned internal cohesion. The report is cognizant of some of the recent storms in transatlantic relations. It calls for a kind of code of conduct among allies, an annual political self-assessment, a center for democratic resilience to rebut foreign influence in democratic institutions. And then finally, I would just underscore the importance of the decision-making recommendations, the recommendations for reform of the decision-making process inside NATO. One of the trickier areas is the tendency, the growing tendency, or let's say the growing frequency of single country blockages. So the practice of certain allies on a rolling basis, year in, year out, to on an individual basis, prevent NATO, the other 29 members from moving forward with aspects of the agenda. This often involves importing external bilateral disputes into NATO. This is a feature that in a more competitive geopolitical landscape becomes much more serious impediment to NATO functioning and could lead to paralysis. And then finally, the need to allow subgroups of allies to operate under the NATO chapeau and to time limit decision-making in a crisis. Those were some of the more important recommendations from my standpoint. But I want to emphasize again throughout the report we grounded our recommendations, I think, in a well-founded optimism about the future of NATO. If anything, NATO is more relevant today than it has been at any point since the high point of the Cold War. It's an environment that we're moving into that calls less for crisis management or maybe out-of-area operations, but more for the strategic consolidation of the West itself, politically and strategically. And I hope we will see the alliance move in that direction. But thank you again, Christian, for the opportunity to join this call, and to the other speakers who are on the line. Thank you.
Wes, thank you very much for making time for this discussion. I think it's very, very useful, very timely, especially also with the election year coming up, and NATO topics to the domestic audience are sometimes an uphill battle. Having said that, Heiner Braus has fought that battle, be it here in Berlin or be it in Brussels, quite a time as Assistant Secretary General on NATO Defense Policy and Planning. Now I got the title right. Thank you. Well done. Yeah, but that's the only thing I can do. You're much better placed in saying, okay, which recommendations of the more than 100 should we take first, Heiner?
I would take the recommendation to update the strategic concept first, because this is instrumental to adapting NATO towards 2030. In my view, the report of the reflection group led by Thomas de Maizière and Wess Mitchell is a very comprehensive and substantial strategic level document, and I've read it 3 times meanwhile. And I agree with Wess that the 138 recommendations are all politically and practically plausible. It's worth considering them, and it's necessary to implement most of them. I do not agree to each and everything regarding the critics expressed by Thomas de Maizière on NATO EU, but this has to do with the fact that when I was in NATO, everything was better, of course. And I'm skeptic with some of the suggestions made on how to adapt the decision-making procedures, but this need to be discussed in detail. In my view, many of the strategic findings and policy recommendations should be incorporated in NATO's updated strategic concept to lead NATO towards and to the way towards 2030. I would go so far to say that the report could have or should have a similar impact on NATO's development as the Armel report in 1967. The dual track approach of the Armel report comprised credible deterrence and defense, alongside efforts to reduce risks through dialogue and arms control, and informed NATO's development over decades. Today, there is, in my view, or in accordance with the report, another dual approach required to lead NATO, the alliance, towards 2030. As Thomas de Maizière expressed at another occasion, NATO should remain responsible for the security and stability of the Euro-Atlantic region, and at the same time cope with the strategic and global implications of the rise of China to great power status, and as a consequence, the shift of the US strategic center of gravity from Europe to the Indo-Pacific region. That is the decisive point. And it needs to be recognized that due to the emerging great power competition at a global scale, we need to look holistically at both the Euro-Atlantic and the Indo-Pacific theater, acknowledging that international stability will depend on the United States and Europeans' commitment in both regions simultaneously, not equally, but in a way simultaneously. That said, given the concurrency of so many different challenges and threats, great power competition, hybrid threats, non-state actors, emerging and disruptive technologies, climate change, terrorism, as well as the allies' different locations, concerns, interests, and priorities, I agree completely with the group's main concern, as I see it, to make every effort to consolidate NATO, to ensure its cohesion, to keep it united. Otherwise, it would not be possible for it to cope with these strategic challenges that I've mentioned. Therefore, and that is one of the key recommendations in my view, NATO needs to a culture of consultation and the primary and the recognition that it is the primary political forum for discussion of all security issues the North American and the European allies are concerned with. It needs to ensure that these views of the allies converge, that the role, NATO's role and function as a political clearinghouse, if you wish, is being strengthened and recognized by all allies. All allies need to adopt a genuinely strategic mindset, as the group has highlighted, and develop a shared vision of NATO's strategy. In order to achieve a common understanding on the strategic threats, in particular, the Chinese challenge, which is, as Wess just mentioned it and put it, the key strategic development of our time, if you wish, and to establish and strengthen partnerships with the Indo-Pacific democracies, Australia, Japan, South Korea, but perhaps also India, as the report rightly points out. The update of the strategic concept of 2014 must be the means and the vehicle used to establish such a common strategic mindset and to converge the views of 30 allies and to achieve a new strategic consensus on NATO's role towards 2030. To this end, I believe we need a new transatlantic bargain, a new balance of burdens, responsibilities, and benefits between the United States and the European allies. The US military presence in Europe and its extended nuclear deterrence remains indispensable to balance Russia's strategy and growing military and nuclear potential, and to maintain reassurance for all allies about the stabilizing role the United States continue to play in Europe. At the same time, a free, democratic, united, prosperous Europe that is able to act as a strategically as a partner of the United States is essential for maintaining America's role as a global power. So the US, I believe, should not reduce their forces in Europe, and I very much hope that the Biden administration will not implement Trump's decision in that regard. But on the other hand, Europe needs to do much more for its own security. That means for deterrence and defense vis-à-vis Russia, for crisis management in the southern periphery, in the Mediterranean region, North Africa, and the Middle East, in supporting the United States in maintaining freedom of navigation, which is even more important for European economies than for the United States, including from time to time in the Indo-Pacific region without touching the Article 5 commitment. And finally, maintaining the nuclear sharing arrangement in Europe, including particularly by Germany, which must be part of this transatlantic bargain. For Germany, this means that we have to achieve the full readiness of the German armed forces as soon as possible, earlier than planned up to now. 2032 is too late. It must play a primary role in support of deterrence and defense in Europe, alongside the United States forces. And we need to implement the NATO capability targets earlier than envisaged up to now. And as I mentioned already, nuclear sharing arrangement need to be part of our contribution to NATO 2030. And for the European Union, And we can discuss the role NATO-EU cooperation is playing today. And that is difficult for the EU functionaries and staffs and European enthusiasts, very difficult to accept. They also need to contribute via PESCO and European Defence Fund to developing capabilities that are usable for the whole mission spectrum. That means also for high-end defense, not just for crisis management. Notwithstanding the fact that NATO remains responsible for collective defense in Europe. But all Europeans, 21 of which are NATO members, and 6 are close NATO partners, including now the United Kingdom, need to develop together capabilities that are usable for all Europeans and the whole transatlantic community. For example, a key capability is completely lacking in Europe, air and missile defense. Thank you very much.
Thanks very much, Heiner Braus. Maybe before now hundreds of questions are coming in, may I ask, you pointed towards the German armed forces, which I think, especially for this audience, is the right pointer. The question to you and to kind of everybody is, so, but it looks like we are not able to deliver. Plus, we have an ongoing discussion about changing the NATO planning objectives or NATO planning targets. How do we, now it's all the recommendations are basically just a piece of paper if Germany doesn't turn around and if Germany doesn't deliver, which currently looks kind of, I wouldn't say it's a crystal ball, but it looks like we're getting more and more into this direction. So how important is Germany for delivering some of these objectives? Or couldn't we just stand a little bit not in the center of all these things? I'm not sure who wants to give a first idea on that. Otherwise, I can offer a question. Wess, if you want to come in.
Yeah, just briefly, Christian. Well, I would argue, from an American perspective, Germany is the critical variable in Europe, given the size of the German economy and population. I would say, particularly in a post-Brexit environment, when we think about stability and security in Europe, for Germany to not execute on its commitments, I think would be deeply harmful to future of NATO. And I think a wider point that I just want to emphasize, I think it's embedded in what Heiner has very cogently pointed out, that increasingly the fact of the rise of China and the siphoning effect it has on U.S. strategic attention and resources, I think it does put the burden sharing, the old burden sharing debate in a new light. That's crucial to understand, that it's no longer just about America complaining that Europeans don't spend enough on defense. And I think it's also not just a sense of responsibility on Germany's part, but it's actually that European and German, the ability to deliver on military commitments is actually intimately linked to the international, to strategic stability, security at the international level. And so I think that's an important point to absorb. And obviously from a biased American perspective, that's how I would answer that question, and concur wholeheartedly with Heiner.
Thanks very much. Question possibly to Siim.
May I comment it now?
Yeah,
not as a co-chair, but as a German politician. I'm questioning, what do you mean by to deliver? Germany has to deliver. What do you mean?
Heiner Braus,
I've heard him, and I couldn't agree with him more. He knows that. But what is to deliver? Just to spend money? Of course,
no, to deliver the three.
But for what?
And we have put on paper.
We have to talk about capabilities, about readiness. This is important. There was a lot of improvement in the last years. So I think the development of capabilities, set of forces and things like that is better than the German reputation is. My concern is not so a professional one, but a political one. And this is that in Germany, security and NATO is in a way self-understanding that it doesn't seem to be necessary. So how can you fight for 2% of the GDP when you don't agree on threat perceptions, or for what reasons you spend money? The out-of-area missions are very important, very expensive, but not extremely successful. We have to admit that. So we don't talk about the Russian investment in the last years because it's all secret. I don't think this is the right way to have public discussions. So our role model is to be like Switzerland or so. And if we take like countries like Canada, Norway, Netherlands, for role models for us, then I would be more optimistic. So to have a more realistic view on security issues, to broaden the community. I like all in the audience here, but I know a lot of them. Retired diplomats, soldiers, all members of the same mainstream. This is not enough. We cannot change this public debate in Germany when we are among ourselves. So this is my concern. To deliver means Germany needs another approach to security issues. But from a professional point of view, there was a lot of progress in the last years.
Yeah. Siemke, I wanted to come in on this, I guess.
Yeah, thank you, Thomas de Maizière, for especially for the last point. This this is something I would like to underline. For example, we have the threat analysis of the European Union done under the presidency of Germany and the European Council. But this is an EU secret, so that is even for German politicians not very easy to get it. Of course, we can apply and say we want to read it, but then we have to read it in a very secure room, and we cannot take notes. So we must discuss why we do it, and why we do security for our people of whole Europe, and also for the NATO alliance, to explain and the reason and the content of our of what we do, and for what we do, and why it is worth it. I think this is something that we really have to do, and so that people understand where the threat is, and maybe that they share the perspective that is worth it. So I've definitely underlined what you just said, and I think that if I take a look on the budget that we have now, you might still suffer from the cuts that you had to face as you were a minister, caused by the peace dividend. Because before we had always a very low budget, and we had always cuts in the budget on defense. But since 2014, we have risen the budget by almost double. So we have, at the moment, I think we are around 46 billion or 47 billion euros on the defense budget, which and this is something that I want to say, especially as a social democrat, because we, as a partner in the coalition, we share the perspective that our army needs some investment, and that is why we have risen the budget, and we are now at 47 billion euros. I think this is the right way, but it's more the way to talk about capacity and about what our different parts of our military has to be able to do, and which service they have to do within the different alliances and in the different missions that we serve. Than about only money and 2%. This is I'm really convinced by this point, because in the end, if I have also a closer look in procurement and in how we repair our military material, there is, we would say in German, there's Luft nach oben. So there's still a long way to go to make it better and to make it more, to have it in an easier way, so that we have it more efficient, more effective, and we have more material in the hands of our soldiers to do what they have to do. I think so. If it's a bit superficial only to look on the 2% and what we put in the budget, if I have a closer, more detailed look, we have really almost doubled the budget, and we will still have a way to go to make our material, our service, our procurement, and also the repairing of our material better, so to play a bigger role even in the missions.
Thanks very much, Camilla. I have Emma Brook who's raising the hand. Everybody else who wants to come in, either you try to raise your hand also by using the the reaction button down on the bottom list, or you write a question into the chat, or that you want to raise a question here, just write it to the chat. Emma Brook, you're next.
Thank you very much. I very much agree with what Thomas de Maizière has said, that we have to give reason, the argumentation for the public. When you want to increase the budget, you must have the support of the citizens. And I would not put a few points on top of that. When we talk about security, then we have to see a broader look into a strategy in security, a broader definition of security. When we see, for example, that the European Union, its member states, have given 20 times so much money to Ukraine than the United States. When the European Union, its member states, give 60% of the development aid of this world. If I see the enlargement of the European Union and the costs, then has it to do with security. And I can give a lot of other answers. That should be included, and that can be done partly only via the European Union, and that has to be taken into account. And hopefully the Biden concept on trade will help us also to use jointly trade. The European Union can play an important role for security matters when we look into the China case, for example. I would not mention in this case Nord Stream 2, which is another question in that context. But let me make also another remark. I agree that we have to increase and to have to do more. But can we make a big difference and all the European countries get to 2%? Or can we have only a real difference if we get synergy effects on the European Union? Synergy effects in a proper way. General Baus, that is not just a question of functionaries and enthusiasts from Brussels. There are also a few other people who are realists. Perhaps next time we should invite people from Brussels. Thank you very much. Wess is here. Wess is here. Brussels is represented by an American in this group here. and
thanks very much, Emma Brook. Maybe I can pick this up. And so we had public opinion on the one hand, and spending more or synergies on the other hand. And maybe I can, because I'm looking around in the auditorium, winning hearts and minds is one of the challenges that think tanks have, and winning 50% of the population also means winning more women over into this dinosaur business. Mrs. Müller, what shall we do? I mean, I already counted as a success that we have more female participants in these rounds than we had 10 years ago. Nonetheless, how do we get them more active?
Thank you very much for the concrete answers to the European question. Thank you.
Yeah, I guess the panel will have the opportunity to answer that, because I'm just the moderator. I'm not answering questions here.
So how to engage female and younger people to security debate? I started as a young female with Model United Nations and discussing about security and peace and war. Of course, in a role play, but it was always very interesting to me. And sometimes I think that we women, we have to just grab also the positions on the panel. For example, I always, usually I don't go to panels where there are only men, especially when then there's a moderator, which is female, because then I know that it's not the women that have to put in the knowledge, but only do the moderating and being there for looking nice. But in the end, we have to be, maybe we have to broaden what was said before, even the security or the access to the security question, because it's not only about military, it's also about social security. I mean, I grew up in Europe also. I want that my children grow up in peace and security in Europe. So this is maybe a different approach. And I believe that we will have more female speakers in the security policy when we have more females doing service in the military. So we will have more female experts also in military terms. Or maybe it's also because we sometimes are only in between us, what Thomas de Maizière said before, that we just talk in between us and then we don't open for people who don't have the expertise so far. Maybe we should think about formats to open up for non-experts.
Thanks for that. I would like to give the floor to Hannah Braus, and then afterwards, because they're coming in questions in the chat, maybe Rüdiger Lenz wants to pose his question to the audience, as well as Tilman Leicht, possibly.
Yeah. Just one remark. I have to leave at 7:15, so excuse my rudeness when I leave, but I have to catch the last train to Berlin.
Thanks. Hannah Braus.
I fully agree to what Thomas de Maizière said, that we need a public debate, an open public debate about threat perceptions, the security developments in Europe and beyond, even at a global scale, and a truly public political discussion. But you will agree that Siemte Möller and you are one of the few politicians and parliamentarians who are doing that. There are not very many. To my knowledge, in the last couple of years, there has not been any single Bundestag decision about German defense policy, German security policy, about the White Book. Not to my knowledge, I must admit. So it's a matter of political leadership. Not just you two, but the political leadership in Germany to engage. In 2014, we had a fundamental change of our security situation in Europe. Since then, the NATO Council, the foreign ministers, the defense ministers, the heads of state, they all approved a series of fundamental strategic documents, which altogether have created already a strategic adaptation of NATO, but with a focus on Russia in the east and instability in the south. I have not experienced, maybe I didn't realize it, that this has been properly explained to the German public. Yes, the documents are secret, some of them even top secret. Yes, they need to be consolidated in the updated strategic concept in one way or another, but they can be translated. You are right, we are always within our community who are telling to each other what it means. But now we, the Germans, and Wess put it very clearly, we are considered not only by the US, but by our European partners, in particular in the East, as the Central European nation. Not to give an example in adapting to the new strategic environment. Now we are confronted with China, and the existing threats have not gone. So we have, the challenge has been doubled. And now to try to answer the question raised by Emma Borg, and I apologize for my expressions. I myself served in the European Union several years, and I know it pretty well from within. We need to be honest, and Thomas de Maizière said it very clear at another occasion. There are two different cultures in NATO and the European Union, and these cultures are maintained by the staffs, so by the staff members, not so much by the nations, but by the staffs. We need to bring the cultures together, and it can be done if we have commitment, openness, open-mindedness, and leadership example on both sides. That is lacking in my view. Give you a concrete example. In order to be credible in Europe, in reinforcing our allies in the East, we need to create all the conditions required to move forces across Europe very quickly. That is called military mobility. The European Union plays a key role in that regard. They have established an action plan for that. They have made a lot of progress. They need to work closely together with NATO And it's also a need for NATO to contribute to that. They need to have a common understanding of the challenge. They need to create a common understanding. And they need not only to have action plans in their organizations, but a common action plan to be implemented step by step, but supported by both organizations, and in particular supported by those capitals that are members of both NATO and the European Union. That is what I think would create synergy and complementarity and coherence between the two organizations when it comes to capability development.
Thanks very much, Heiner Braus. Rüdiger Lenz, if you are ready, you posed a question, a comment question in the chat. Would you like to read it or say to the audience again? Because I think it's much better if somebody does it compared to the moderator.
Thanks. Wess rightly so talked about the necessity of deconfliction amongst allies. And I'm wondering why one problem which is high on the agenda and of geostrategic importance, the Nord Stream 2 thing, has not been mentioned yet. Because that, instead of the 2%, which is a problem which can be solved, seems to be the great stumbling block amongst allies at the moment, and seems to get out of hand because it's escalating by the day. So my question to the panelists, especially to Thomas and also to Siemtje Müller, how can we de-escalate this problem which we have at hand?
Thanks very much, Rüdiger. And Tilman Leicht, if you're still there, would you like to come in and pose your question also to the audience and to the panel?
Yes, absolutely. Thanks very much for taking my question. So I wonder which policies do you consider apt enough to prevent emerging technologies from triggering in sort of era of nuclear insecurity in the coming decade is my question. So I believe we see sort of the myth of nuclear policy that nuclear weapons would pacify international relations. I think it's safe to say that that might not be the most correct statement or idea. And I wonder what we can do to sort of these new emerging technologies, faster delivering nuclear weapons or harder to detect. How can we draw up regimes that could prevent us from entering an era of nuclear insecurity in the coming years? Thank you.
Thanks very much. And maybe last but not least, maybe Rolf Nickel also wants to pose his question on the arms control issues. And then I would give it back to the panel.
Yeah, thank you very much, Christian. Thank you very much for this very interesting debate. I was just coming back to what Thomas de Maizière alluded in the beginning when he talked about this issue, he said something about arms control and disarmament, well, rather arms control. Can you elaborate a little bit more on the proposals that were made? And maybe, if I may, one other very short question with probably short answers. I understand that this was a consensus report, but can you talk a little bit behind the scenes? Which were the most controversial issues you discussed, if that is not too indiscreet? Thank you very much.
So that's the potpourri for the panel. Nord Stream 2, emerging technologies and arms control. What can you offer, Thomas de Maizière, Wess, Heiner Braus?
We are not going to open secrets for good reasons, because you need loyalty to such a group afterwards as well. Otherwise, you cannot reach consensus among countries. But of course, we have had discussions on the role of democracy, values, because of some countries and behavior of some heads of state. Is NATO has NATO a role to guarantee democratic values? Yes or no, and how? This was one big issue. The other one was, of course, about Russia. What is the role of NATO towards Russia's aggressive approach? So we need a lot of time to describe the role of Russia, but in the end we found a consensus. And then on China. There was another round last week, and there was a former foreign minister who asked, why is China a business for NATO? And I think it's a good question in an old traditional way of thinking. And Wess and me answered it. China is not Russia for a lot of reasons. But China's role is related to security issues, and this is what NATO should deal with. And this was a matter of discussion as well, not as a dissent, but how to describe it. There was a wording within the group. We didn't put it into the paper. It was NATO has to think global and act transatlantic. Klammer auf, except perhaps of out-of-area missions on terrorism, Klammer zu. But to define your own security interests vis-a-vis a world power, I think is an absolute necessity for the future of NATO. And that was a huge matter of discussions. Now, on Nord Stream 2, well, Wess put it nicely. We had a look to NATO 2030, and this problem is then probably solved. So this is my easy answer today. Now on the role of EDTs. And I start with arms control. It's easier. In a way, the old system of arms control is collapsed. Not only because of Trump or because of Putin, because it was related to traditional answers, rockets and tanks. And this has not to be destroyed, it had to be developed. But if we are honest, NATO never negotiated on arms control, except perhaps on verification. America negotiated. But NATO was a forum for consultation. And this has to be implemented again, that no ally should read in the paper what's going on in arms control. They should discuss it during consultation processes. This is what Hannah Braus mentioned by culture of consultation. Number one. Number two, perhaps it's a new approach to deal on arms control with the EDTs. How to use space, how to use independent weapon systems, how to deal with cyber attacks. Something like open sky to cyber attacks would be a great advantage, but difficult to get. And there could be not only a role for America, but for NATO as well, at least to make offers, to persuade our people that NATO is relevant again. So this, I think, is a very important recommendation in our report. And the second role is of EDTs. I mentioned it in my presentation about vulnerabilities, dependencies. Are we able to have our own decision-making processes, including new technologies, in 2030? And I mean we, NATO, or are we dependent on critical infrastructure on China or others? This is a security question and a political question. Is it a matter of NATO that Piraeus now is owned by China? Is this important or not? By the way, it was an idea of the European Union that they should sell it. But the question is, where is the forum to discuss those issues? Which type of critical infrastructure in space, in cyber, on artificial intelligence? Where are the clouds and things like that? What of these issues are security related? And this NATO should be a forum to discuss it from a political point of view. Then there is a huge field for cooperation with European Union, because the European Union there has a possibility to have standardization and things like that. And this is a huge field to identify common interests with America while respecting that we are industrial competitors. So this is the political role of EDTs mentioned in our report. Wes, open some secrets.
Sure. Well, all of these are interesting and provocative questions. And I'll just say, Rudiger, it's very good to see you again. I think you've put your finger on the pulse of something important with energy security and broadly for NATO and Nord Stream 2. I would just say energy security is a notoriously difficult area for NATO for obvious reasons. It gets deeply into national and economic competencies. So it's a challenge, I think, also structurally for NATO. But it was important to Thomas and me that we be the first commission of this kind that does grapple in our report with the question of NATO's role in energy security. I don't think we ignored the issue. In fact, I think what we gave are some pretty sensible recommendations here. We don't mention Nord Stream 2 by name for some very good reasons, but we describe a role for NATO, for example, an annual NATO-wide assessment of energy security and energy security infrastructure in a deterrence and defense context. We were actually surprised in our consultations to find that that's not already part of the normal DNA and practice of NATO, but it's very much needed. We also called for a plan at NATO, which currently doesn't exist, to ensure an uninterrupted supply and the protection of energy security infrastructure in the Euro-Atlantic area, including against hybrid threats in an Article 5 environment. And when you consider the vulnerability of a lot of the current infrastructure as is, much less in a scenario of some varying amount of strategic exigency, I think it's clear that more needs to be done in this way. Also, bringing energy security more into NATO scenarios and planning. I think the questions that I heard from Tillman and Rolf on both emerging technologies and arms control are very good ones. On emerging technologies, it's hard to add very much to what Thomas has said, but I would just say I think the organizing problem is Russia's new way or new generation warfare concepts and applications, first and foremost. So hypersonics, drones, the application of artificial intelligence to the battle space, space weapons, cyber. Obviously, the Chinese are pioneering some new areas under this heading as well. And I think there's a disconnect between how we conceptualize, we being Western nations, conceptualize some of these capabilities and say the Russians do. I mean, for Russia, these are capabilities that are intended for strategic and political effect. So deterring or controlling the cost of conflict, leveraging the United States or NATO into negotiations. Certainly in the United States, most of these fields of emerging technology or application are looked at mainly through an operational lens. So as part of a warfighting concept rather than competition across the spectrum of conflict. So I would just say, I think these are exactly as Thomas has said, I think they're potentially very fruitful topics. There are big strategic stability implications from emerging technology that have not been fully assessed or really assessed at all. We're really at the beginning of that process. But I think it's also challenging because the very areas in emerging technology where the stability concerns are the greatest, so AI or cyber, are exactly the topics where traditional arms control approaches or limitations approaches may actually be the least viable. So do you, for example, tie certain classes of technology to the strategic force balance, or do you try to separate out negotiations on space, cyber, et cetera? You know, you could have limits on testing and deployment or capability and range. But because so many of these applications are dual use and are very hard to count or quantify, a lot of the traditional arms control approaches don't work well. So the role that I think I see for NATO, and the report hints at this, it doesn't get into great detail, but there's a role for NATO that I think is analogous to the role that NATO played in the period after the Harmel report, when the United States had lost nuclear superiority. People forget one of the great enhancements to NATO functioning after the Harmel report was precisely in the field of arms control, bringing more consultations on arms control into NATO platforms broadly, but specifically having European allies who were, for example, pressing the Warsaw Pact, or we were building tools like the multilateral force reduction platform, or, well, actually some of the tools that led to the creation of the Conventional Forces in Europe Treaty and OSCE. So I think we're at an era of creativity that's maybe roughly analogous to where we were in the late 60s, early 70s. And that's actually a good thing. I think I'm cautiously optimistic that there's more of a role for NATO in arms control of the next 10 years than there has been at any point in probably the last 20 or 30.
Thanks very much, Wes. We are almost coming to an end. Maybe I can pose one last question to the panel with a request to answer sharp and short. Can Germany, with a new government, avoid the 2% question? And if, then how? Maybe I start with Heiner Braust.
I fear we cannot. I don't think that the Biden administration will give up their insistence and their call on Germany to fulfill what the head of state and government have promised and pledged in 2014, in 2016, and 2017, and 2018. And up to now, Germany is the only nation that has unilaterally changed these commitments. And again, from experience in NATO, this has of course disappointed the Americans, but even more so our European allies, who would like to rely on our credibility and our commitment. But at the same time, I would say focusing on this figure is the wrong way. The figure is not an end in itself. It is just a political indication of a nation's commitment to spend money, invest money in capabilities. So what is needed is the discussion about why do we need a ready Bundeswehr? Which capabilities are required to contribute significantly and adequately to NATO's deterrence and defense posture? Why do we need to do that? Although we are not directly exposed to a Rust threat as Lithuania, Poland, and Romania. Why do we need to do that as an ally to support the whole alliance, which is also a security guarantee for ourselves? So that is the discussion we need to have. And you might not believe it, but I'm optimistic that the new government will be able to enter such a discussion, to turn a little bit the focus from the mere figure to the purpose of investing into capability for political reasons.
Wes, what do you think? Can we avoid this discussion? Can Germany avoid the discussion?
Well, of course not. And I will say, as the American on the line, I mean, with all due respect, I'm often surprised when I hear continued reflection on the 2% debate in Germany. I tend to think of Germany as kind of the epitome of multilateralism. And certainly I think, German political culture has a solid concept of solidarity and responsibility. And yet when we come to NATO 2% commitment, this somehow is an exception, and it shouldn't be an exception at all. To me, even if I were German and not American, it's very simple. There was a public commitment that was made by all allies, including Germany, to meet a certain set of benchmarks. Yes, capabilities are part of the picture, but first and foremost, 2% of every nation's GDP would go towards defense spending as it is currently defined, not a futuristic concept of what security in an elastic sense would mean. And so I would argue that first and foremost, do what you've said you will do. It's critical for the integrity of NATO that it keep its commitments. I think beyond that, certainly a discussion about the definition of security or capabilities and investment, sure. But I would say first, meet the burden of the main and plain requirement that you've committed to, which is actually integral to deterrence, the functioning of deterrence. And as I said a moment ago, I think internationally, stability of the international system at a moment when there are changes in the international balance of power that are very serious. So the world is changing all around Germany. Germany benefits tremendously from the status quo in the international system. I think both the international security order that's largely serviced by the United States and the international economic order. And to my mind, we should already be at the second or third stage of that debate. I think it's enough to simply say, as a self-respecting member of the NATO alliance, Germany should keep its commitments and do what it said it was going to do.
Thanks. And last but not least, Thomas de Maizière.
Well, Germany cannot avoid it. And possible partners for a new government will learn that within months. And Germany should not avoid it. Because it's an interesting point. It's not enough for German public debate to say, we promised it years ago. It's not enough. It's a formal argumentation. You need a substantial argumentation why it is important. And there you need a discussion about what Heiner Boss said, capabilities. I would add qualities. So you need quantity and quality, both. The Biden government will make it more different for Germany and Europe because of his tone. It was very easy to neglect the challenges from Trump because of his attitude, and very popular in Germany. So, well, when he says that, we are not going to agree. So if Biden and his team will say the same with another tone, it's more difficult to neglect these debates. But don't forget COVID-19. Don't forget the debts for all the countries, perhaps including America. So I wouldn't be shy to make the prognosis that not Germany, because of the skepticism of America and others, but other countries, Italy, perhaps France, perhaps Spain, Portugal, others, they will then perhaps discuss about the 2% goal because of COVID-19. Not about the goal probably, but about the time to get it. So this can be a new debate. And when we have recessions, then of course it's not so difficult to get 2% for a defense budget. So you need additional criteria as well. And for that reason, the COVID-19 discussion is perhaps a chance to not only to talk about the 2%, but what are you doing with the money for defense?
Thank you very much to our panelists, also to Siemtje Möller, who left us a little bit earlier. Also, thank you to the audience for raising questions. I apologize for not being able to take everybody in all the questions. There are still some hands up and some questions in the chat room that I wasn't able to pose, but we will do this next time. And we'll definitely have a next time because all the panelists set the agenda for discussion for this interesting year that is upcoming year, which is an election year. And we will definitely not be able to avoid security, especially not defense topics. And I take it as a word, we will not, and we shouldn't avoid them. We should basically take them up front. But I will leave you now to your hopefully very nice evening. And see you soon again at this beautiful virtual place. Thank you very much for your attention. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye-bye.